You know what's fascinating? People often assume that the only way to stand up to someone who's emotionally avoidant is through confrontation, through telling them exactly what they're doing wrong. But the truth is, confrontation rarely changes an avoidant person. In fact, it usually makes them double down, retreat further, or find new ways to protect their fragile ego. But here's what most people miss. The super empath doesn't need confrontation. They don't need long speeches, ultimatums, or drama. What they do instead is far more subtle and far more powerful. See, the avoidant thrives on control. They pull back, create distance, and wait for you to chase. They believe you'll keep proving your worth, trying to earn a crumb of validation. That's their script. But a super empath knows the game and chooses not to play. Without a word, they shatter the avoidance ego simply by refusing to orbit around it. They stop chasing. They stop trying to decode mixed signals. They stop assigning value to breadcrumbs. Instead, they turn their attention back inward to their own self-worth, their own joy, their own life. And here's the twist. Nothing is more unsettling to the avoidant than someone who doesn't need their approval. Silence, absence of reaction, and emotional independence speak louder than any argument could. The avoidant suddenly finds themselves exposed. Their old tactics, distance, hot and cold behavior, testing your patience, lose all their power. That's the subtle brilliance of the super empath. They don't fight the avoidant. They simply refuse to validate the ego games in the first place. And in doing so, they remind the avoidant, without a single word, that their control was only ever an illusion. Avoidant personalities often operate on a very subtle yet powerful form of control that many people don't recognize until they're already emotionally entangled. Their strategy isn't about grand gestures or open dominance. Instead, it's about the push and pull of attention, the deliberate creation of uncertainty, and the careful use of distance. When an avoidant pulls back, they're not just stepping away, they're silently setting a stage where the other person feels compelled to move forward, to bridge the gap, to do the work of maintaining the connection. This is where the control lies, not in what they actively give, but in what they withhold. The moment someone begins chasing, questioning, or trying to win over an avoidant, the dynamic shifts. The avoidant gains the upper hand because they no longer need to give clarity or reassurance. They've created a situation where the empath, or the more emotionally invested person, is left scrambling to secure a sense of safety that never arrives. This control isn't loud, it's quiet. It isn't obvious, it's hidden in the spaces between responses, in the delayed text, in the cancelled plans, in the subtle tone that says, "I'm here, but not fully." For the avoidant, this pattern is protective. It shields them from intimacy, from vulnerability, from the risk of rejection. But for the person on the other side, it feels like an endless audition. The empath begins to wonder, what did I do wrong? How do I get them to come closer? What should I change about myself to be worthy of consistency? And this is exactly how the avoidant maintains control, by positioning themselves as the scarce resource, the one whose presence must be earned. When the empath plays into this, even unknowingly, they feed the avoidant's ego. Every time they chase after reassurance, every time they try to decode silence, every time they accept crumbs of affection as though they were a feast, they reinforce the avoidant's belief that they can dictate the rhythm of the relationship. It's a dance choreographed to keep the avoidant comfortable and the empath off balance. What makes this control so deceptive is that it's not aggressive. It doesn't look like manipulation at first glance. In fact, the avoidant may appear calm, even aloof, while the empath looks like the one who is overreacting. That contrast only strengthens the illusion of control. The avoidant gets to sit back, convinced of their emotional superiority, while the empath burns energy trying to fix what was never theirs to fix. The truth, though, is that the entire dynamic relies on the empath's participation. Without someone chasing, the avoidant has no power. Without someone trying to fill the silence, their distance is meaningless. The game only works if one person plays along. That's why super empaths eventually realize the quiet power in stepping away from the script. By refusing to participate, they don't just reclaim their energy, they dismantle the entire structure the avoidant depends on. The avoidant thrives on control through distance and mixed signals, but that control only exists as long as someone is willing to keep reaching for it. Most people think the only way to handle an avoidant is through confrontation, through spelling everything out and demanding answers. They imagine that if they explain clearly enough or pour their heart out with enough intensity, the avoidant will finally wake up and meet them halfway. But that strategy almost always backfires. Confrontation doesn't soften an avoidant, it makes them retreat further. The avoidant's ego is built on the idea that they don't have to be accountable, that they can dictate the pace of intimacy, and that if pressure comes their way, they can simply pull back and let the other person chase harder. So when someone confronts them, they don't feel moved, they feel justified in withdrawing. Super empaths approach this differently. They understand that words are not what shift dynamics, energy is. The avoidant feeds on the empath's attempts to fix, to explain, to prove. The more the empath gives, the more the avoidant feels validated in their stance. So instead of confronting, the super empath does something far more radical. They stop. They stop investing energy into trying to force clarity. They stop decoding every subtle signal. They stop rehearsing speeches in their head, imagining how they might finally break through. This doesn't mean they give up on themselves. It means they redirect all that energy inward back into their own well-being. The power of this lies in the subtlety. The super empath doesn't announce their shift. They don't send a long message saying, "I'm done playing this game." They don't declare, "You can't control me anymore." They simply remove the emotional fuel the avoidant relies on. That silence, that lack of chasing, says more than any words ever could. It unsettles the avoidant because the script they've relied on, the dance of pull back, get chased, re-engage on their terms, suddenly stops working. Their control dissolves not through confrontation, but through absence of reaction. This quiet withdrawal creates a mirror. The avoidant, for the first time, is left alone with their own tactics. When there's no one chasing, no one scrambling for reassurance, the distance feels less like power and more like emptiness. The avoidant ego, which thrives on feeling superior and needed at the same time, starts to wobble. They may test harder at first, pulling back even further, waiting to see if the empath will cave. But when the empath holds steady, the avoidant has to face something deeply uncomfortable. Their patterns don't work on someone who values themselves too much to play along. What makes the super empath's approach so effective is that it doesn't require explanation. There's no big confrontation for the avoidant to twist or dismiss. There's nothing for them to argue against. Instead, they're left with the undeniable experience of their control slipping through their fingers. This is where the ego begins to quietly shatter, because it was never designed to stand alone. It was designed to feed on reaction. And when reaction disappears, the avoidant is forced to sit with the hollowness of their own walls. By quietly stepping back without drama or speeches, the super empath shifts the entire balance of power. The avoidant may never admit it out loud, but they feel the difference. They sense that something fundamental has changed and that their old strategies have lost their effectiveness. That realization alone is what makes silence more powerful than any confrontation could ever be. Withdrawing attention and validation is one of the most powerful moves a super empath can make, not because it punishes the avoidant, but because it fundamentally changes the dynamic that the avoidant depends on. Avoidant personalities are fueled by the reassurance that no matter how much they pull back, the other person will always be there waiting, reaching, or proving. They thrive on the chase, not because they consciously enjoy it, but because it allows them to maintain the illusion of control without ever having to offer full emotional availability. Every time someone responds to their silence with anxiety, every time they try harder to earn affection, the avoidant's ego quietly swells. It reinforces the belief that they can remain distant and still hold power. The moment attention and validation are removed, that belief is shaken. Suddenly, the avoidant no longer has someone orbiting around them, feeding the narrative that they are the prize to be won. What once felt like a reliable source of affirmation, knowing someone would always bend to their rhythm, disappears. The silence, the absence of reaction, creates a void that the avoidant cannot easily explain away. Unlike confrontation, which gives them something to push against, the withdrawal of energy leaves them with nothing to fight and nothing to dismiss. It is destabilizing in a way that words never are. This shift is especially effective because validation is the avoidant's hidden currency. They may pretend they don't care about reassurance or admiration, but their ego is sustained by it. They rely on knowing that their hot and cold behavior is powerful enough to keep someone hooked. So when the super empath stops giving that validation, when they stop praising, stop chasing, stop trying to prove their worth, the avoidant begins to feel the quiet sting of irrelevance. And for someone whose entire defense mechanism is built on maintaining superiority while avoiding vulnerability, irrelevance is the ultimate threat. Withholding attention isn't about coldness or cruelty. It's about reclaiming energy that was being misused. The empath recognizes that constantly validating someone who withholds affection is like pouring water into a bottomless bucket. It never fills, it never satisfies, it only drains the giver. By stepping back, the empath takes that water back and begins to pour it into their own life. They invest in their passions, their friendships, their growth. This creates a contrast the avoidant cannot ignore. Where once they were the center of gravity, now they are simply a distant object in someone else's orbit. The beauty of this approach lies in its subtlety. The empath doesn't need to announce, "I'm done validating you." They simply shift where their attention goes. Instead of giving emotional reactions to mixed signals, they give that energy to things that genuinely bring fulfillment. The avoidant notices even if they don't acknowledge it. They notice the lack of response to their withdrawal. They notice that their silence no longer pulls the same desperate attempts at connection. They notice that their tactics no longer land the way they used to. This quiet unraveling of their perceived control leaves them unsettled in ways they can't easily articulate. What emerges is a reversal of roles. The avoidant, who once believed they held the upper hand, begins to feel the absence of attention and validation like a loss. The ego that was used to being fed now feels the discomfort of hunger. The super empath doesn't need to confront or explain this shift. Their silence and redirection speak volumes. It demonstrates without a single word that validation is no longer on offer and that the avoidance power was never real. It only existed as long as the empath agreed to fuel it. The moment that energy is reclaimed, the illusion falls apart and the avoidant is left facing a reality they can't control. Silence and self-focus have an effect that words rarely achieve, because they don't invite debate, justification, or denial. When someone tries to call out an avoidance behavior directly, the avoidant often retreats behind defensiveness or dismissiveness. They might minimize the issue, project blame, or simply disappear to avoid responsibility. Words give them room to twist the narrative, but silence leaves no room for manipulation. It communicates through absence, through the sudden lack of attention, through the calm refusal to engage in the cycle of pull and chase. That lack of reaction pierces deeper than any carefully constructed argument because it denies the avoidant the emotional fuel they depend on. For the avoidant, power lies in their ability to provoke. When they pull away and someone comes running after them, it confirms their sense of importance. When they dole out mixed signals and the other person scrambles to interpret them, they feel in control. The avoidant ego is validated each time they can influence someone else's emotional state without offering much in return. But silence interrupts this pattern completely. When the super empath chooses not to react, not to chase, not to feed the game, the avoidant is confronted with something they cannot control: indifference. That indifference is more destabilizing than anger or confrontation because it suggests that their tactics have lost their effect. At the same time, self-focus adds another layer of power. When the empath takes all the energy they used to pour into trying to fix, decode, or please the avoidant and reinvests it into themselves, they create a shift the avoidant can't ignore. Suddenly, the avoidant is no longer at the center of the empath's world. That spotlight, which once reassured them of their value, dims. And instead of obsessing over the avoidant's behavior, the empath is out living, thriving, and building a life that doesn't revolve around someone else's emotional unavailability. This quiet act of self-prioritization doesn't just protect the empath's peace, it exposes the avoidant's ego for what it truly is: fragile, dependent on external validation, and hollow without an audience. The combination of silence and self-focus is so effective because it operates without confrontation, yet it communicates everything. It says, "I don't need your approval." It says, "Your absence doesn't define me." It says, "My attention is a privilege, not something you're entitled to." And all of this is said without a single word. The avoidant feels the weight of that message in the shift of energy, in the absence of pursuit, in the reality that their old strategies no longer yield results. The truth is, the avoidant's ego cannot thrive in silence. It feeds on reaction, on being able to trigger and control. When those responses vanish, the avoidant is left alone with their distance, their coldness, their inconsistency. And it doesn't feel powerful anymore. It feels empty. And that emptiness is precisely what shatters the illusion they've been clinging to. The super empath doesn't destroy the avoidant's ego by attacking it. They let it collapse under the weight of its own dependence simply by turning inward and refusing to fuel it. True power in relationships doesn't come from proving your worth to someone who is emotionally unavailable. It comes from recognizing that your worth was never in question to begin with. Avoidant personalities operate in a way that makes others feel as though they must constantly earn closeness, attention, or love. The avoidant keeps the bar just out of reach, enough connection to keep someone invested, but never enough consistency to allow them to feel secure. This dynamic tricks people into believing that if they just do more, give more, or prove more, eventually they'll be rewarded with stability. But the reality is that reward rarely comes, and the cycle of proving only deepens the avoidant's control. A super empath eventually realizes that this cycle is a trap. No matter how much they give, it will never change the avoidance patterns, because the avoidance distance isn't about the empath's inadequacy, it's about the avoidance fear of intimacy. Recognizing this truth is what shifts the balance of power. Instead of trying to convince the avoidant to see their value, the empath chooses to live from the understanding that their value exists regardless of whether the avoidant acknowledges it. This is emotional independence at its core, the ability to stand firmly in self-worth without needing external validation to feel secure. When an empath embraces this independence, everything changes. The avoidance tests, withdrawals, and mixed signals no longer carry the same weight. What once might have sent the empath into a spiral of overthinking now becomes noise that they no longer feel responsible to interpret. They stop over investing in someone who refuses to meet them at the same level. By not chasing or pleading, they remove the avoidance illusion of control. That illusion was only ever sustained by the empath's willingness to fight for crumbs of affection. When that willingness disappears, the avoidance ego loses its grip. This independence doesn't just weaken the avoidance control, it strengthens the empath's entire sense of self. Suddenly, their happiness is no longer tethered to whether or not someone else shows up consistently. They discover the richness of their own life outside of the avoidance attention. Hobbies, friendships, passions, and self-care become places where their energy flows freely, without resistance or fear. This not only restores balance, but makes the empath even more magnetic, because nothing is more attractive than someone who is whole within themselves and unwilling to compromise that wholeness for inconsistent affection. The irony is that the very thing the avoidant was trying to avoid, true intimacy, becomes more possible when the empath stops chasing. Emotional independence sets a clear boundary. I don't need you to validate me, but I am open to connecting if you can meet me authentically. This kind of energy dismantles ego-driven dynamics and replaces them with self-respect. The avoidant may or may not rise to meet that standard, but either way, the empath stands in power. Because in the end, the strongest position in any relationship isn't convincing someone to value you. It's knowing you are valuable whether they do or not. And so, what we see is this. The avoidance ego isn't shattered through arguments, ultimatums, or dramatic exits. It's undone by something far simpler and far stronger, the quiet strength of the super empath. By refusing to chase, by taking back their energy, by valuing themselves above the games, they show the avoidant that real power doesn't live in control or distance. It lives in self-worth. The lesson here isn't just about avoidance. It's about any relationship where you've ever felt you had to prove yourself to be loved. The truth is, you don't. The moment you stop performing for crumbs, the moment you stop giving energy to someone who withholds, is the moment you reclaim your power. That's when the dynamic changes. That's when the illusion breaks. And that's when your own life begins to expand in ways it never could when you were waiting for someone else to see your value. So if you take one thing from this, let it be this: your silence, your self-focus, your independence. Those aren't just tools for survival. They are your loudest, most undeniable message. Without a single word, they tell the world, I know who I am, and I don't need you to define me. Thank you so much for being here, for listening, and for choosing to honor your own worth. Take this with you, live it out, and let it remind you every day that you are not chasing approval. You are standing in power. Goodbye for now, and thank you.